This is the BBC Home and Forces programme. Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour. The Axis forces in the Western Desert, after 12 days and nights of ceaseless attacks by our land and air forces, are now in full retreat. It's known that the enemy's losses in killed and wounded have been exceptionally high. Up to date, we've destroyed more
In 1942, a massive battle unfolded in northern Africa. Axis forces from Fascist Italy and Third Reich Germany advanced deep into Egypt following the Mediterranean coast. They reached a point just 100 kilometers, or 62 miles, west of Alexandria and the edge of the Nile Delta. At a site called el-Alamein, the Axis forces were repulsed by Allied troops including British, Libyans, Indians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, the Free French, Poles, and Greeks. The Allies had dug in well, spending months fortifying strategic locations, preparing choke points, and laying mines. As the Axis forces pushed eastward, stretching their supply lines, they found their strength blunted, blocked, and ultimately beaten. At the edges of Egyptian territory, the coastal defences held. As the enemy began their retreat from Alamein, Allied soldiers pushed westward. Their march would take them past a site called Mersa Matruh, which had also seen heavy fighting. Then, a small village called Zawiyet el-Rakham, which is not recorded as a battle location, but was inhabited. From there, the advance moved towards Libya, following the coast, pushing the Axis back. 3,300 years earlier, another army marched these roads. An Egyptian force heading west passed by the communities we now know as Alamein, Mersa Matruh, and Zawiyet el-Rakham. The army marched in the name of Usir Ma'at-Ra, that is, Ramesses II. They came to fortify the coast. In the aftermath of World War II, Egyptian inspectors began to conduct archaeological surveys of the Western Desert. It was a dangerous task. The surveyors often had to have military escorts sweeping the area for mines or unexploded ordnance. But the inspectors, like Labib Habashi, one of the great archaeologists of Egyptian antiquities, were able to identify several interesting sites. Many of these seemed to date to the reign of Ramesses II. The traces were small, but potentially significant. Stone stelae, pieces of buildings, and even the ruins of fortresses testify to this period. From the 1940s to the 2020s, archaeologists have worked to uncover these sites. The most significant location is far to the west, about 300 kilometers or 186 miles from Alexandria. It is called Zawiyet el-Rakham, and here an ongoing excavation has uncovered a stronghold built for Ramesses II. Zawiyet was a substantial bastion with walls 5 meters thick or 16 feet, and covering an area about 19,000 square meters, or 4.8 acres. The garrison, approximately 500 men strong, could patrol the coastal roads and the desert routes that led to inland oases like Siwa. The fort at Zawiyet was named Pa Demi Usir Ma'at-Ra, or the town of Ramesses II. Not the most imaginative moniker, but it gives historians a date of operations for the fortress. We even know the name of its commander, an overseer of troops and foreign lands named Neb-Ra, meaning Ra is Lord, or belonging to Ra. Other sites strung along the North African coast and the western edge of the delta include similar references to Ramesses II and his army. Why were these bastions here? Inscriptions from the sites reveal Ramesses' overall goal. At el-Alamein, for example, a building fragment bears hieroglyphs saying that the pharaoh, quote, plundered the Libyan land in the moment of his power. and at Zawiyet el-Rakham, the commander Nebra left monuments of his own. One of those texts described Ramesses as, quote, "the one who brings an end to the transgressor of his borders." Based on these fragments, it appears that Ramesses was concerned with the security of his western frontier. Tribal groups from the land now known as Libya were crossing the borders of Egyptian territory. Historically, the Egyptians had a love-hate relationship with the Western peoples, whom they usually called Chechenu or Chemehu. They had fought, but also traded, the Libyans bringing ostrich feathers and eggs, cattle products, and even warriors who served in the Egyptian army. But the nomadic tribes were not a single unified people, and naturally there were conflicts, which appear in Egyptian art and texts over many centuries. So they had a long history of back and forth, friendship and fighting. However, in the late Bronze Age period, around 1350 BCE, something started to change. Written records begin to reference new tribes beyond the traditional Chechenu. From the 18th dynasty, we hear about groups called the Meshwesh and the Ribu, or Libu, from which we probably get the word Libya. Based on the fragmentary records, the Meshwesh and Libu seem to have come from the coastal regions far to the west, what today we would call Cyrenaica. And in the decades to come, these peoples would give other pharaohs a substantial headache. Under Ramesses II's successors, tribal coalitions, including the Meshwesh and Libu, tried to invade Egypt from the west. It's possible that fortresses like Zawiyet el-Rakham and others in the western desert were designed to offset that danger. Zawiyet was not just a military bastion. It also protected trade routes coming from the Libyan tribes and also from the sea. Archaeological evidence, like pottery, hints at the arrival of traders coming from Crete, Cyprus, and further afield. Seaborne merchants visited Zawiyet to trade with the Egyptians and maybe carry on along the coast to larger centres. So while it was a stronghold, it also served other economic purposes. The fortress at Zawiyet is complemented by other traces at Mersa Matruh and el-Alamein. Those other two sites might have had fortresses, but that has not been demonstrated archaeologically. At the least, we can say the coastal road had some fortifications and troops patrolling it. Ramesses was securing the limits of his western border. Of course, the Sahara is a vast expanse, with multiple tracks crisscrossing the waste. So any traders, or raiders, hoping to reach Egypt had multiple paths to access. As a result, the Egyptian army fortified other sites along the western delta. One of these was in the headlines recently. At Tel Abqain, northwest of Cairo, archaeologists have been exploring a large fortified settlement. Within the ruins, they found a sword, bearing the titles and names of Ramesses II. I described that discovery back in September 2024. I won't repeat the story here, but a couple of noteworthy points. The fort at Tel Abqain dates to the reign of Ramesses, based on pottery and artifacts. So it's probably contemporary with the other sites like Zawiyet Umm, which tentatively points to a chain of forts along the western delta and coastal road. Some of these forts have been confirmed, like the bastion at Tel Abqain and another at el Faran. Others are tentative until excavations can take place. At the very least, historians have the makings of a strategic image. Along the western edge of the delta and the Mediterranean coast, King Ramesses II funded a series of forts. Secure strongholds and battalions of troops would occupy important locations, controlling access to the oases and the coastal roads. It seems that Ramesses was guarding his western borders. Having secured the frontiers to the west, Ramesses could now turn east. Our narrative picks up in 1289 BCE, regnal year 4, under Wasmuria Ramesses or Usir Ma'atra Ramesses II. Having spent the first 3 years of his rule concerned with domestic affairs and defending the frontiers, Ramesses now felt strong enough to go forth on his first campaign of victory, or Wedjet Tepit Net Nechet. This first campaign of victory is an interesting beast. We know it happened based on written inscriptions along the Mediterranean coast. Ramesses left records with dates at places like Tyre, Byblos, the Nar el-Kelb, or Dog River, and other sites in Lebanon. All of those sources, though, are damaged, either fragmented or badly weathered by wind and rain, so the texts only survive in scraps. There are just enough pieces to say that Ramesses was here in year 4, and based on the location of these sources, we can build a rough itinerary for what he was trying to achieve. The story begins at Byblos, where, on the coast of Lebanon, we have a stone stela of Ramesses. The inscription, slightly weathered, touches on the campaign of this year. It says, quote, Year 4, the 4th month of Shemu, day unknown. His person, the king, was victorious, powerful, and valiant like Montu. His sword smote the chiefs upon their heads. He is one who acts as far as the circuit of the sun's disk, the Aten. He is rich in love, effective of plans, and victorious of arms. His troops and chariots are likewise as those who extend the boundaries of Egypt. He is the warrior, great in victories. Ramesses travelled the roads which are among the mountain ridges of Kuru, or Canaan. His army went on, he being alone, until today. End quote. The text is weathered and garbled, and it mostly just praises the pharaoh, so there's not much to go on in terms of events. But amid the rhetoric, Ramesses does leave a couple of tidbits. He describes himself marching through the hills of the region, which he calls Kuru. The pharaoh also mentions something about his army going ahead while he was alone, presumably with his bodyguard. That is a literary motif. The king is a hero, brave and willing to go by himself. It will appear again in Ramesses' propaganda. But if the king is talking true at all, Ramesses may have divided his army into contingents to cover more regions. So the Byblos stela is not much to go on. But it is a start, and at the very least it gives us a date. Year 4, the 4th month of Shemu, roughly July in the modern Western calendar. In this hot summer period, the pharaoh, along with his chariots and foot soldiers, entered Canaan. Where were they going? Based on the surviving records, Ramesses was heading north, and he probably went as far as the land of Amurru. Nominally, Amurru was a vassal, but it was a troublesome vassal. The leaders of this region had gone rogue repeatedly in recent decades, switching sides between the great empires or following their own path according to political winds. From the perspective of Egypt and their northern rivals, Hatti, Amurru was reliably unreliable. At this point, the lord of Amurru was named Benteshina. We do not know much about him beyond a tiny reference in the Hittite texts. More on that later. But as far as we can tell, Benteshina lived up to his name. When Ramesses appeared in Amurru, Benteshina bent a shin to the pharaoh.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Down to his knees, the Amorites submitted. Almost. Apparently, Ramesses did have to fight at least one battle in this general area. A temple relief from Nubia shows the king and his troops attacking a fortified town called Irkata. Irkata is a well-documented Amorite community. Now known as Tel Arka, it is about 20 kilometers from Tripoli. According to his art, Ramesses besieged this town, The imagery shows Pharaoh in his chariot, riding towards the foe, who scramble away in fear. They flee towards their town, unable to resist the onslaught. The Egyptians triumph, the battle is won. Classic stuff, more of a propaganda reel than a photograph of true events. But it adds a bit of visual flair to the fragmented historical records. So Ramesses attacked Irkata in northern Lebanon. He was not the first pharaoh to do this. Thutmose III had gone there on one of his many, many campaigns, and following that subjugation, the rulers of Irkata appear in the Amarna letters, sending messages to the Egyptian court. After that, the town fell under the power of Amorite lords like Aziru and Abdi Ashirta, until Seti I, the great king, led his rampages in Canaan and Syria. Following that battle, the artistic scenes on the temple wall shift to the victory celebrations. Ramesses stands before Amun-Ra, who offers him the sword of victory. The god praises Pharaoh, saying, quote, "My heart is happy when I hear of the victories of your strong arm or sword. Great is your might, O Ramesses. I give to you the southerners, together with the northerners, so that you may satisfy your bloodlust upon them. Take to yourself the sword." End quote. Again, it's classic stuff, but it's one of the few sources we have for Ramesses' targets in Amru. The king came to Irkata, laid siege to it, and reduced it to submission. Beyond that single town, we don't hear of any others, which maybe adds to the idea that Ben-Teshina, the lord of Amru, submitted to the pharaoh's rule. Surprisingly, we might get confirmation of this from the Hittites. A clay tablet covered in cuneiform writing preserves a treaty between the Hittites and Amorites. This took place about 60 years after Ramesses came to Amru. The treaty was made by a Hittite ruler named Tudkhaliya IV, and in that treaty, he referenced how things had gone back in the days of Ramesses II. The Hittite said, quote, "When Muwatalli, my uncle and predecessor, became king in Hatti, the men of Amru committed an offense against him. They informed Muwatalli that we were voluntary subjects. Now we are no longer your subjects. And they went over to the king of Egypt. Then my uncle Muwatalli and the king of Egypt fought each other over the men of Amru. Muwatalli defeated the king of Egypt, destroyed the land of Amru by force of weapons, and he subjugated it. And Muwatalli made Shapili king in the land of Amru." End quote. This treaty text, with its little flashback, includes a surprising amount of useful information. First of all, it mentions the battle between Muwatalli and the king of Egypt, which is almost certainly the Battle of Kadesh. Naturally, the Hittites claimed victory in that conflict, and we'll explore that at the appropriate moment. The other bits of information are equally valuable. As the treaty says, the king of Egypt had come to Amru, and the lords of this region had turned away from Hatti in order to give their loyalty to the pharaoh. Subsequently, in the last part of the flashback, we hear about the Hittite response, how, following his battle at Kadesh, the Hittite king came to Amru, deposed its ruler, Ben-Teshina, and replaced him with a new one, someone called Shapili. Unfortunately, this document doesn't specify who the Egyptian pharaoh was. Technically, it could have been Seti I, Ramesses' father, who also came to Amru in force, and who, in his later years, was a contemporary of Muwatalli. In the context, though, we generally assume the treaty is referencing Ramesses, because he and Muwatalli definitely faced off directly at Kadesh. But if you're into the nitty-gritty of history and how we reconstruct it, there is a shred of ambiguity there. Anyway, apparently Ramesses II came to Amru and asserted his authority. The local rulers, most of them, submitted to his power. Ramesses might have had to fight at least one battle at the town of Irkata, but after laying siege and defeating the locals, he had confirmed his sovereignty over this region. Subsequently, the king and his army turned south once more. They began their march home, back towards Byblos or Tyre. And along the way, Ramesses decided to stop on the banks of a river. In the shadow of a rocky outcropping, the pharaoh left a mark of his victorious passage. Today, you can find stelae of Ramesses II at a site in Lebanon called the Nahr el-Kalb, or the Dog River. Ramesses left 3 of these stelae, 1 in year 4 and 2 more in subsequent visits. The stelae follow a pattern. Ramesses stands before a god like Ra, Amun, or Ptah, and hieroglyph texts describe the relevant campaigns that the king was making. Because of their location right near to the coast, the Nahr el-Kalb stelae are badly weathered from wind and rain. We have just enough texts to read quotes like, Year 4, the 4th month of Akhet, day 2. The good God, victorious of troops, the Lord of the sword, whom Amun himself fashioned, the Horus, Ramesses II. End quote. Really generic stuff. Basically, the only useful bit is the date. Ramesses came to Nahr el-Kalb in year 4, the 4th month of Akhet, the flood season, which would be around November. If you connect that with the earlier record from Byblos, it suggests that Ramesses was in Canaan and Syria from the 4th month of Shemu, late July, to at least the 4th month of Akhet, late November. A decent stretch of time, all things considered. Based on later campaigns, like the attack on Kadesh, we know that Ramesses' army could move from the eastern delta all the way to Lebanon in about 30 days. When you factor in the time to march into Lebanon and then return, you're probably looking at a campaign of 6 months, or maybe even longer. This wasn't a flyby visit. Ramesses was occupying these communities for an extended period of time. So the pharaoh invaded Canaan, Lebanon, and Amurru, stomped around for a bit, asserted his authority, and then returned home. What was the point of all this? In the short term, Ramesses' first campaign was a show of force, demonstrating his power and military strength. It was a sensible move so early in his reign. The transition between regimes, like from Seti to Ramesses, was always a sensitive moment when vassals might test the resolve of their new overlord. The fact that Ramesses felt secure enough to wait for 3 full years and only march in year 4 suggests that Canaan and Syria were relatively quiet. Or, alternatively, it suggests that the western and northern borders back in Egypt were unsettled enough that Ramesses had to take the time to fortify them. Either way, Ramesses would need to make an appearance in Canaan at some point and demonstrate his power. Additionally, some military historians have viewed this campaign as a preparation for wars yet to come. With the benefit of hindsight, the pharaoh's push into northern Lebanon and the lands of Amurru seems like an attempt to secure the western border, a way to protect Ramesses' flank as he prepared to move eastward against the Hittite Empire. There may be some truth to this. As we will see, Amurru was part of Ramesses' approach during his next campaign, the campaign to Kadesh. But that is a story for the next episode. Thank you for listening to the History of Egypt podcast. Stick around at the end to learn the surprising history of Ramesses' inscriptions at the Nahr el-Kalb in Lebanon. Some remarkable figures and armies have copied these inscriptions in their own way. The legacy is surprisingly long. There was a fair bit of archaeological information in this episode. That stuff doesn't lend itself so well to the narrative, so as always, there's a lot that I had to leave out. If you're interested to learn more about Ramesses II's fortresses and the defences of the frontier in this period, I will include some links to presentations by noteworthy archaeologists working at these sites. Some of them are available for free on YouTube, so if you'd like to learn more, that will be in the description. As always, I must thank my supporters on Patreon, who are so generous with their money and help me to pay for important resources like rent, coffee, and my most recent obsession, bugle chips. I've never had these before, but they seem to be a thing in the UK, and they're really delicious, so thank you for supplying my bugle habit. Of course, I must give an extra shout out to the priests, my top tier supporters on Patreon, who are the most generous with their money, and I am in their debt. My thanks to Linda, Niden, Siyen, Eric, Ashley, Dan, Terry, Daniel, Chris, TJ, Veronica, James, Yola, James, Setnacht, Mycost, Jeffrey, Suyon, Andy and Chelsea, Jean, and Karen. Folks, you are all too kind. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that your journeys to foreign lands, preferably as holidays rather than campaigns, can last 6 months or more for the utmost enjoyment. Thank you for listening. I'll see you soon. In modern-day Lebanon, Ramesses left inscriptions at the Nahr el-Kalb, or Dog River. These are the first known inscriptions on the site, but they weren't the last, not by a long shot. Over the coming centuries, other rulers would visit the Nahr el-Kalb and leave their own markers of conquest. In the 670s BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon left a victory stela at the site. He is noteworthy for going on to conquer Egypt, incorporating it into the Assyrian Empire. A century after him, a Babylonian ruler named Nebuchadnezzar II carved his own stela at Nahr el-Kalb during his campaigns in this region. Then there are stelae for Hellenistic rulers, possibly including Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. There are Roman emperors like Caracalla, Mameluke rulers like the Sultan Barkuk. There are Imperial French under Napoleon III in 1861, and even the Western Allies fighting against Vichy France in 1941. The litany is long. The Nahr el-Kalb has become something of a victor's parade, testifying to the passage of dozens of armies. As far as we can tell, it was a trend started by Ramesses.